Ok, velkommen til en spesiell episode av Skravleklassen. Som dere alle vet, så har det vært noen uker uten sending. Dere kan sikkert gjette hvorfor. Det har vært korona, det er oppfordring om hjemmekontor, det er ønsket at folk ikke drar fra en by til en annen. Jeg bor i Lillesand, og vi tar opp podcaster i Oslo, så vi beklager det, men jeg håper dette blir et lite eller forhåpentligvis stort plaster på såret, for i dag har jeg med en gjest som jeg vil påstå etter snart 100 episoder at jeg aldri vært så gira på en gjest som jeg er i dag. Jeg har med meg forfatter Tom Neill fra Los Angeles, som har, det er vel 1 år siden boken kom ut nå, skrevet boken Chaos om, undertitelen er vel Chaos, CIA and Charles Manson Murders, som jeg har nevnt litt om på podcasten tidligere, og jeg tror jeg bare skal sette i gang og snakke engelsk med en gang, fordi han snakker ikke norsk, så vidt jeg vet. Jeg håper dere setter pris på denne samtalen. So, Tom!
Nice to, how you doing?
Nice to have you here.
Nice to be
here. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, nice to be
fine.
It's peculiar times, let's just say that.
Yeah.
Today it may be announced who is going to win the presidency, just as like in an hour or something.
It could be any minute, but they've been saying that for about 2 days, but this morning they really think it might happen. And my cousin is actually married to the senator of Pennsylvania's sister, and they've told us, our family, that he's got inside knowledge that Pennsylvania is going to announce today that Biden won Pennsylvania, and then if Biden wins Pennsylvania, then it's all over. Well, it's all over in Trump's mind, because Trump's going to fight it and not leave the White House. It'll be interesting.
I lived in LA a couple of years ago, 2018, so I just have to ask you, is it okay if I smoke? I know you're Californians are very strict about that. It's not passive.
No, I'm not getting the passive smoke.
Before we delve into the main topic here, who are you rooting for? Is it allowed to ask that question?
Oh yeah. Well, obviously, Biden. Yeah,
Biden. Yeah.
Trump is. Hopefully, our country and the world will recover, but I think it's going to take a long time to recover from all the damage he did.
But do you like in a vacuum? Look beyond Trump. Do you actually like Biden? Do you think he's a strong candidate?
Oh yeah, I think I like him a lot. I do have concerns about his age, but I think that the fact that he's going to have a great cabinet and he's got a vice president who's sharp as a tack, that I think we can overcome any of that. I mean, Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's the last couple of years he was in office. Nobody knew about it till after, but people suspected it. And anything is better. I'd rather have an infant than the one we have in the White House now. So
he is an infant in many ways. Do you think Biden and Kamala Harris are able to put the leash on the CIA?
I don't know. I mean, I actually had my own little battle with Kamala Harris about 4 or 5 years ago, which made me disinclined to like her. She was the Attorney General of California. And I was trying to get access to the convicted assassin of Robert Kennedy's files. And with Robert Kennedy's, the guy's name is Sirhan, with his attorney. And he was at an evidentiary hearing, a new hearing for Sirhan. And she was the one who had the ultimate say, and she denied it. And she actually wrote some pretty disturbing stuff in her denial, where she acknowledged that there very well could have been a conspiracy to kill Robert Kennedy and a second gunman. But the fact that one gunman was in prison was enough, and it didn't need to be looked at again. And that shocked me, because for historic reasons, I think you need to know the truth about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who was on his way to becoming elected the president of the United States. I think she did that for political reasons more than anything else, but that has kind of bothered me since he announced that she was going to be her vice president. But again, in comparison to what we have there now, it doesn't matter anymore to me. I'll deal with that down the line.
Two gunmen at least is a step forward from three gunmen with JFK.
Yeah. But in a position of authority would admit that we had presented enough evidence of a second gunman, but then say, but we're not going to allow a second hearing or trial. If there's a second gunman, then you have no idea how much responsibility Sirhan had. I mean, we believe he was being manipulated and controlled anyway. So she's acknowledging that, yeah, it looks like you showed us that there was a conspiracy and we don't know what happened. That should be enough. But, for political purposes, she would have then had to live with that. If she opened it up, it would have been scandalous because it would have led to the CIA. And I think because of her political aspirations, she didn't. And that's going to be our new vice president. But, again, you have to change because of the context of what else is going on in the world. And it's much less cool.
Yeah, but let's keep the current affairs. It's too much disinformation. It's impossible to know anything about what's actually happening right now. That's my thesis anyway. Mm-hmm. Much more interesting in looking at what happened in the 60s. It's much more easy, or I wouldn't say easy because you spent 20 years investigating
right.
this book, but it's more maybe not more palpable, but more. We have some distance to the 60s. Mm-hmm. It's easier to get an overview. So let's just start with the beginning because 90% of my listeners doesn't know anything about you or your book, I would reckon. Okay. So let's just start with the obvious. Chaos. Mm-hmm. What's the book about?
Well, it began as a magazine article that was supposed to take a look at the murder of Sharon Tate, a movie actress in Los Angeles in 1969, who was killed overnight in her house with 4 or 5 house guests by a group that later turned out to be led by Charles Manson. And that's something I'm curious about in your country. Do people know who Charles Manson was, or?
Yeah, the thing is, with Norway, we don't. It's an old saying or an old truth that we never had this dubbing like they have in Germany and stuff. So we have subtitles. We were Americanized because of the NATO alliance and our proximity to Hollywood culture and everything. So I think people are well aware of the Manson murders, but I don't think they know just how huge it was. Like if you go past the JFK assassination or even the Lincoln assassination, I think it's as you said, it's the biggest trial together with O.J. Simpson. It's the two biggest.
Yeah, it had a big cultural impact. In the United States at the time, we were at the height of a war, the Vietnam War. There was a massive resistance to the war by left-wing and mostly younger people. There was a lot of racial strife. And then there was the introduction of drugs, specifically LSD, around 1966 into the culture. And by 1967, there was this kind of explosion that really, the center point was San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury district. And out of that began what they call the hippie movement, where kids were all of a sudden deciding they didn't want to conform to society's norms, not necessarily get married, not necessarily have children or have kids, but with different partners. Just everything was questioned for the first time in America, culturally, really, since the founding. And that all kind of turned the country into like a real kind of a boiling, there was a boiling point because of the stress of the war, and American kids were getting drafted and killed in a war that nobody believed in. And instead of going, they were resisting and then dropping out of society, living communally, taking drugs, listening to the new music that was emerging, the Grateful, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, all of that really centered in the hate. And in the middle of all this...
My mom was there.
Oh, was she there, living there? Or?
In New York. She lived in New York, but she went to Woodstock and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, then she's probably told you some of it. But in the middle of all this, this felon was released from prison who was, I think he was about 32 then, Charles Manson, who was just con artist. You know, he'd been in and out of federal institutions half of his life. So from the time he was a boy of about 12 or 13, he was raised by a single mom who herself was a petty criminal. He was basically sent to reform schools and juvenile detention halls and never really lived independently of the system from the time he was about 11 or 12 until he was finally released from the juvenile system at 18, at which point he immediately began committing crimes, and mostly nonviolent crimes, stealing cars, working with prostitutes, you know, as a pimp.
What do you call a juvenile delinquent?
Well, he wasn't a juvenile anymore because now he's 18, 19.
No.
Yeah. So he's getting arrested and sent to federal prison. And he was in and out of federal prison till 67 when he was finally released on parole to Los Angeles. Now, when you're paroled to a district, you have to stay in that district and abide by the rules of the system until you've proven that you can live in society. Usually a parole term is anywhere from 1 to 2, 3, or 4 years. And his parole term, I believe, 2 years. He immediately violated his parole by going up to the Haight in San Francisco, which is 400 or 500 miles north of Los Angeles. And in normal situations, he would have been immediately sent back to prison for that violation. Would have had to serve out what would have been the last 2 years of his term. But instead, they gave him a break. They permitted him to stay. They assigned him to a research program called the San Francisco Project, and a parole officer named Roger Smith, who was conducting research for the government about what's called recidivism, which is why some parolees do violate and get sent back to prison, why others can acclimate and become good citizens again, which is the hope of the government. He was also doing drug research, Roger Smith. So Manson became his client, for lack of a better word. And during about a year in San Francisco, Manson, who could barely read and didn't really have any kind of charisma, or there was nothing interesting about him. People who were in prison with him before said he's a small man. It's like there's an argument whether he's 5'3" or 5'5", but they just treated him like a gnat. You know, he was just in the way.
Yeah, he was a nobody.
Nobody, yeah. But within a year, he learned how to kind of become this guru-like leader who got all of these young people, mostly women, in the beginning it was all women, to believe in everything he said, to the point where they would do anything he asked them to do. They followed him around, walked behind him, and during that period, he and them were using lots of LSD primarily, and he pretty much rewired his followers' brains to become like robot automatons who did whatever he said. He migrated, and he's breaking laws all this time. You know, he got arrested several times, and every time his parole officer, rather than sending him back to prison, would allow him to remain free. About early 68, he and the group migrated down to Los Angeles, and they first lived with Dennis Wilson, a drummer for the Beach Boys, who they had encountered hitchhiking, and they took over his house for about 2 months. And it was just like one constant orgy and party where some well-known rock stars would come and sleep with Manson's girls, who ranged in age from 14 to 25 and were growing. At that point, he had about 20 girls and maybe 3 or 4 guys following him. And then Dennis Wilson, who was paying for all this, got fed up with it finally And he left the house. It was a rental rather than he was scared to throw them out. And the owner of the house had to come and evict them. Then they migrated to Spahn Ranch, which was a broken down Western movie ranch where they did a lot of TV and movie shows from all the way back to the 30s. And in exchange for taking care of the horses at the ranch, they were given free lodging and food. And the owner was an elderly blind man named George Spahn, who was in his 80s. And
yeah, we saw him in the Tarantino movie, right? The blind guy.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, so that part was depicted, and that was a pretty good depiction of what the ranch was like. That long scene when the Brad Pitt character goes to check in on George. And then by 1969, things had really changed, and Manson had started prophesizing a race war that he called Helter Skelter, which he named after the Beatles song that had come out that year. And he claimed that the Beatles were speaking to him through the lyrics of the White Album, which had been released, I think it was January of 69. And also that he was interpreting biblical passages, and that what was going to happen through his mystical intuition was there was going to be a massive race war, and the blacks were going to end up victorious and wipe out the whites. He said that during this race war, he was going to hide his family, his followers, in a secret hole in the desert that he'd located. And they'd live there till it was over, and then they'd reemerge, and they would dominate the blacks, who he claimed were subhuman, make them slaves again, and then he would repopulate the world with the rest of with his perfect offspring. So,
and they would live off a tree with 7 fruits.
Pardon me?
They would live off a tree with 7 fruits.
Yeah. Down at the bottom of the hole, there was going to be rivers of honey and trees of fruit. And, his followers completely believed this. And when it wasn't happening fast enough, this is according to the official prosecution version, he announced that it was time to do what Blackie is taking too long to do. So he ordered his followers to go up and kill the inhabitants of the house where Sharon Tate lived with her husband, Roman Polanski, who wasn't in the country, and slaughter everybody, not because he knew who they were, just because he had been to the house before, he knew the layout, and he also knew that whoever lived there kind of represented high, culturally admired American white people, and he wanted to look like black militants had killed them. And then that would ignite this race war. So on August 8th, 1969, Tex Watson, one of the men followers, went up there with 3 women and slaughtered
Susan Atkins,
Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and they slaughtered everyone in the house and left a pretty gruesome scene, including using blood to write the word pig on the front door. When the maid came the next morning and discovered this, it was kind of like an earthquake had struck Los Angeles, because nobody knew what had happened. I mean, Sharon Tate was becoming a huge movie star. Her husband was already recognized for, most recently, Rosemary's Baby, which was a blockbuster hit. And the house was known as a party house, where it had kind of an open door policy. Lots of famous people went there, hung out there, Mamas and the Papas, Steve McQueen. So nobody knew who did this. And the immediate assumption was it was some kind of either sex, black magic, orgy gone wrong, or it was a feud between drug dealers who were providing the drugs to the house. But the whole city went into lockdown. And it took about 3 months for the authorities to make an arrest. And that caused an even bigger cultural shock in America. On December 1st, the LAPD announced that they had solved not only the Sharon Tate murders, but a murder that occurred the following night of a couple in Los Feliz called LaBianca. and that they had been killed by a group of hippies that lived on a commune at the Spahn Ranch and were led by a guy named Charlie, who they believed was the reincarnation of Christ and the devil. Days, papers, and weeks, there were photographs of Manson's girls, with a lot of them beautiful, with long, unwashed hair and beads, and babies nursing at their breasts, and guys with beards and buckskin jackets. And for the very first time, people really all of a sudden looked at hippies and LSD and everything as a threat, as a danger, as opposed to being these benign kids who were just dancing and getting screwed up on LSD. And that's why it was a crime that became really important. It kind of was like a watershed moment. The following year... According to several people, amongst them Joan Dillon, is that her name?
Joan Didion. Joan Didion, yeah. She said it was the end of the hippie movement.
She said it was like the end of the era, the end of the 60s ended that morning that she got the phone call by the pool in Beverly Hills where she learned that her friend Sharon and all these people had been killed. It culminated. And I mean, there was a lot of reckless living going on, with all the drugs. When people are doing all those drugs, their defenses are down. There was a lot of misogyny, a lot of, oh, shoot, I should turn this off. Hang on a second.
It's okay.
Thought that was.
But because before the Manson murders and before Alamo, this was kind of coinciding, right? More or less the same time, Alamo and the murders.
Yeah.
Before that, people's perception of the hippie movement was like, maybe they had a lot of sex and they did some drugs, but they were more or less innocent. But
there wasn't
after the murder.
There was no real violence, and it was more the senseless violence and the degree of violence. So when they rounded up the family and had about originally 7 of them in prison or in the county jail awaiting trial, every time they had a preliminary court appearance, the girls would skip into the courtroom, in little mini dresses, singing nursery rhymes, holding hands and laughing. And Manson would act bizarrely. And then when the trial started, we didn't have televisions in the camera in the courtroom then like we did with OJ, but it was a circus that went on for a year. At that point, it was the longest murder trial in the history of the United States, the most expensive. And there were front page stories all over the United States every day about the antics that had happened. Manson lunged at the judge once with a pencil to try to kill him. They all shaved their heads. They would sing. They would mock the witnesses, some of the witnesses who were family relatives of the victims. And they clearly looked like they were all brain dead, like something was wrong. They weren't connecting to the seriousness of their charges. So that kind of ended. I mean, I wasn't the first one to say it with my book. In fact, Joan Didion most famously said it, but that whole thing came to a crashing end with that. Pardon me?
The age of innocence was over.
Right.
But I have to stop you for a second. It's very interesting for my listeners and for me, of course. But since I've read the book, I have to point out that what you lay out here, especially in the start of your restaurant, is more or less the official narrative of the Helter Skelter motif.
Yeah, right.
It's not your narrative. So let's go back to the beginning, because Helter Skelter was a Beatles album foremost, but also the most selling true crime book in history. I don't know, maybe it's changed.
No, to this day, it's a best-selling true crime book, at least in the United States. I don't know about the world, but here, you can get it at any airport or bookstore always. And it's, almost 50 years old.
Because without Helter Skelter, the book your book wouldn't exist, because your book is kind of a rebuttal. Can you say that?
Yeah. My book is a debunking.
Debunking.
Yeah, of Helter Skelter. That's not how it began. That's why it became such a long project. I originally was going assigned to write like a 5,000 word story just on the importance of this crime and the aftermath for a magazine.
Entertainment magazine?
Oh. It was called Premiere. It doesn't exist.
Premiere.
It's a motion picture magazine here in Los Angeles. And, you know, I had never read the book. I was a kid when the murders happened, too young to really be interested or understand what had happened. But I read the book, and then I thought it was an amazing read. If anybody hasn't read it, it moves really fast, and it's pretty terrifying. And it's by the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, and he was one of the first people who agreed to be interviewed for my magazine story. So at the time, the magazine was very well known and respected in the United States, and I've been writing for them and other magazines for about 15 years. You usually didn't have a problem getting people to talk to you, but nobody who lived through this in Los Angeles, this case, would talk to me, from friends and relatives of the victims, people that worked with Roman and Sharon. I was getting peripheral people, but Bugliosi was very important, and I was really consider myself lucky to get him to sit down and talk with me. And I spent a whole day with him. And it was during the 5 or 6 hours that I was kind of grilling him about this, that he said a couple of things, and I don't want to spoil some of the stuff in the book, but they didn't
you
kind of
sell books.
Yeah. Well, not that, but it's just if I give away the ending, and it's hard to explain a lot of this stuff without context. But he told me 1 or 2 things that didn't add up, and sent me on this kind of mission that to find out why he said what he said, if it was so wrong, what was he hiding, what were his motivations. And the whole project kind of spun around and spun out, because the more I looked, the more I realized that the prosecution of the case had a lot of, there was a lot hidden and covered up about what he did. And I then became completely immersed in finding out why he changed facts about the case that I was able to uncover. And that kind of sent me down 1,000 rabbit holes and turned it into...
I'm going to stop you for a second just to clarify for my listeners. You were an entertainment journalist, writing stories about Richard Gere or whoever.
Harrison Ford.
Yeah, you were not a conspiracy theorist like latter-day Alex Jones figure searching for the hidden deep state agendas or whatever. You were run-of-the-mill or mainstream entertainment journalist, my age, like almost 40 years old, and you got an assignment from your editor. You're a good journalist. Can you write up a 6,000 word piece on the 30th anniversary of the Manson murders? You were a bit reluctant, but your editor said you're going to find an angle because you're good. And you read Helter Skelter, and you interviewed Bugliosi, who was also the prosecutor of the case. Again, the guy who wrote Helter Skelter, the most sold true crime book in the history of the United States, the book about the murders. And you saw a lot of imperfections, to say the least, or
discrepancies,
and incongruencies, as we say in and even though you were not even interested in the JFK murders, you were never on the bandwagon with the magic bullet theory or like whatever, but you couldn't look the other way. You saw there was some really strange things going on.
Yeah.
Is that a quite good summary of?
Oh yeah, that's very good. I got reluctantly kind of dragged into it, and I get
the reason why I'm saying this is just to clarify for the viewers that I'm not interviewing a guy who's looking for conspiracies. You stumble upon something, which is maybe not even a conspiracy. We don't know yet, because your book is, I mean, it has an ending, but it's not, you don't get to the, it's still a lot to be done. We all, like Joe Rogan, I also hope for a new book from you, at least some reporting from, that is currently missing. As I told my listeners when I kind of reviewed your book in another episode, dealt with something else. I talked about your book to my Norwegian listeners. I said, like, this is a typical example of, like, the news cycle is filled with all these irrelevant things. We see all these about Trump's hair, or the reality stars doing whatever, football stars taking the knee, or other more or less irrelevant things. But the real big stories, which your book would be in the canon, I would say, like together with maybe Snowden and Assange and WikiLeaks, and like they are so underreported. I'm just reading the Seymour Hersh memoirs right now, and I'm just astonished at all of these stories that he uncovered. I never heard about them before I read this book. Is this?
Well, he got a lot of attention. He got a lot of attention in the 70s. He was finding out and reporting a lot of the big intelligence stories about the corruption of the CIA and the FBI in the 70s. He was pretty much considered the most important investigative reporter. But now, you're right. The culture is just so clogged with meaningless information. And you almost wonder if that's deliberate, because it obscures the important stuff. And it's one that we have.
If I dare to pose, if I dare to pose an hypothetical, can you agree somewhat with my thesis about news that had happened a longer time ago? It's easier to get a grasp on because you get hold on archives, like your book, for instance. You can get into archives, you can see the context, the people who were, let's say something happened right now, like, just sake of argument, the coronavirus is a hoax or whatever. You would never get to the bottom of it, because the people who are immersed in it, who are driving policies, who are doing the bad shit behind closed doors, they are living and breathing and on top of their careers right now. They would do anything to protect themselves, and it's very difficult to penetrate the current. So it's of big value to penetrate the past, at least the recent past, which you have done and many others are trying to do. But the problem is, since it's a long time ago, it's not current news. It's not like, come on, Neill, breaking news. The CIA are bad people.
Well, we actually thought we'd get more attention when the book came out, and I was pretty disappointed. We got a little bit of mainstream attention, but not a lot. And, a lot of people blame that on, it came out at the height of the Trump presidency, where every day there's 5 stories about Trump's crazy behavior. Also, the publishing industry, they don't really have the same promotional machines they used to have. But I thought there'd be more. And honestly, it wasn't. I don't know. Is Joe Rogan known over where you are? People watch him over there?
Yeah, he's very very popular.
Yeah. Well, I never watched him. I know that my friend is friends with him, so I'd heard about him from my friend. And he was the one who got me on. My friend he's a comedian named Greg Fitzsimmons, and he's on the show a lot, Rogan's. So I knew I knew by then that Rogan had this massive platform, and even Greg, Greg had been on Letterman and Jay Leno and these famous late night shows. He said to me that now in his world, which is comedy and television and movies, if you have a choice of being on a late night show like Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert or Rogan, you do Rogan, because there are that many more eyes on it. So I got on Rogan in April, which was almost, it was like 8 or 9 months after the book had come out. But that was the first time I got the kind of massive attention that I was hoping to have gotten earlier. And unfortunately, it was in the middle of COVID. So people who wanted the book couldn't get it, because the minute he announced that I was going to be on, before I was even on, all the hardcovers sold out, and they couldn't restock the the bookstores were closed here, and Amazon was only delivering essential items, and they didn't consider the book essential. So all these people wanted it and couldn't get it until the paperback came out in June, unless they went for the audio book. I've gotten a lot more attention thanks to Rogan. So I'm really glad that my friend did that for me.
I have to stop you again because my listeners have to be with us on this. We have to rewind a bit because you talked about the murders and the book of the prosecutor Bugliosi, Helter Skelter, the motif, the racial motif, where the main narrative was partly that he's going to start a race war by doing these murders, blaming on the blacks, go underground, come up again, take control of the world somehow, and regain white supremacy. It's a pretty kooky theory. But the other main aspect of Bugliosi's prosecution was that he was brainwashing his subjects, but at the same time, the subjects had an inner drive to murder people. That discrepancy.
Yeah, that's what he had to prove. So for the what they call the guilt phase of the trial, which is when all the evidence is presented just to, in the prosecution's side, prove that these people did these terrible things. And after the convictions, the jury convicted the 4 defendants in the first trial of first-degree murder. Then was what we call the penalty phase. And the prosecution was asking for the death penalty. So if you're asking for a death penalty, you have to prove to the jury that the people that they just convicted of murder knew why they were killing and what they were killing for, and that it was premeditated. So to do that, Bugliosi had to kind of reverse his argument, because in the guilt phase, he had said that the killers were just zombies who were doing whatever Manson told them, not really knowing why or for whatever reason. Then in the penalty phase, he had to show that even though they were under Manson's control, they had it within themselves, as he said, in the deepest recesses of their brains or their minds, the desire to kill, and that Manson had located that and triggered it. So they were just as culpable. I mean, Bugliosi was a master at being persuasive, I guess with everybody in the world but me, because he never persuaded me of anything, but he did the jury, and they all got the death penalty. The reason that the Manson and the others were never executed was because the state of California declared the death penalty unconstitutional in the early 70s. So anybody who was then under a death sentence had that removed, and their sentence was changed to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole. So starting about 7 or 8 years after they'd been convicted, all of the family members came up for parole hearings, which they still do, the ones that are still alive and in prison. But yeah, that was one of the most fascinating aspects of the case, where Bugliosi had to do a complete turnaround. And that's another thing that I really looked into. I don't think Bugliosi was wrong. I think that Manson did learn how to find that trigger and activate it, but that's where I think the MK Ultra CIA people came in, because that's the exact same thing they were looking for since the early 50s, trying to learn how to use drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, different psychological factors to create people who would
control people,
kill impulsively and without any idea that they had been manipulated, provoked, whatever.
Yeah. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We have to go back to your book because now we talked a lot about Bugliosi and the official narrative. Okay. You started writing the article 31 years ago? No, 21 years ago. 31 years. 31 years ago is the murder. 31 years.
No, 50. When I started in
51. Yeah. 51 years and 2 months.
Yeah.
Since the murders, and 21 years since you started the book.
Right.
So what was the first instance where you when you discovered that the official narrative was flawed?
Well, it was drips, slow drips. You know, my first interview with Bugliosi, he told me something off the record that really radically challenged a small bit of what had been going on up at the house where the murders happened. And that led me to look at other little aspects, little details that had never really added up to me in the book, about the crime scene, about the timeline, about when the police found out what they found out. And one thing just opened a door to another, to another, to another, you know. And I mean, one of the biggest kind of transitional moments was when I was trying to find out something that Bugliosi even asked in his book, which was at the end of the book, he said, how Manson gained control of these people to the degree that they would kill people who were complete strangers to them just because they were told to, and kill with relish and no remorse. He said, was he taught this by someone? Did he learn how to do this? We'll probably never know. And I realized, you know, that nobody had ever really looked at Manson's time in San Francisco when he became that mastermind. And even in Bugliosi's book, he just kind of skims over it. That's when I kind of left the crime scene and the stuff that happened in Los Angeles and thought, let's go back to the origin of Manson's, you know, time as a guru and find out how that transpired. And I went up to San Francisco and spent off and on probably a year, you know, a few months at a time, interviewing people and trying to find out what happened. And that's where things kind of exploded in a way that I thought I'd already decided it couldn't be a magazine story. It had to be a book. Still never thought it was going to take more than a few years, 5 years, 10 years. Then all of a sudden it's almost 20 years to the day that I got a collaborator in the last 2 years, thank God. And we literally turned in the final edit with all the corrections the day before what would have been the 20th anniversary of the assignment. So yeah, it did by plan. And even to this day, I think if I had to do the choice to do it all over again, I would have rather have not taken the assignment.
Because there are some key players in the book I want to touch upon that really sped you into this rabbit hole. I don't know which end you want to start, but maybe Terry Melcher is a natural starting point, at least chronologically.
Okay.
He was son of was it silent movies? Doris Day? Was it silent movies?
No, not silent. No. Doris Day was the biggest movie star in America in the 1950s. I mean, she kind of emerged in the late 40s, and she was kind of the girl next door, sugar and spice, pretty blonde girl who sang, danced, and acted. And she was really what, I don't know who her equivalent would be today, but like when I was doing this in the beginning, her equivalent was Julia Roberts. You know, she was the highest paid woman, the most popular box office star. She had one child named Terry Melcher, who was adopted by her husband, Marty Melcher. And he was raised in Beverly Hills, you know, and he basically had the world at his fingertips. He was spoiled. His mother was constantly traveling around the world, making movies. And by the early 60s, when surf rock started happening, he had a surf band in his late teens. And I think he realized he was a better producer, an engineer and talent guy than a musician himself. So he began producing records, and he was definitely talented. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was one of the hottest record producers in the industry. And he produced Buffalo Springfield, the Mamas and the Papas, Paul Revere and the Raiders, and wrote music for them too. So by 66, 65, he was one of the golden boys of Hollywood. And he had a girlfriend who was an up-and-coming model and actress who was becoming famous too, named Candice Bergen. And the two of them rented the house on the top of the Hollywood Hills called on Cielo Drive that became the murder house. They lived there for 2.5 years. And in the middle of the night in January of 1969, Terry just got everything, got all of his belongings, and told Candace they had to leave and leave that minute. And that was one of the earlier lies that I found out. Nobody had ever looked at, like, why did Terry leave so suddenly, breaking his lease, going out and living at his mother's house on the beach in Malibu? Well, I found out that something had already happened between he and Melcher, and he felt frightened and threatened. So he
and Manson, you mean?
I'm sorry, he and Manson, yeah. So Terry Melcher provided part of Vince Bugliosi's motive for the murder. So the original motive was to start this race war, but underlying that, according to Bugliosi at trial and in the book, was Manson wanted to instill fear in Terry by killing whoever lived in the house that Terry lived in before, which was a house now Sharon and Roman had moved into. It's a little complicated. So what I found out was Terry Melcher was one of the key witnesses at the trial because he had to provide a reason for Manson to have chosen this house where Manson knew nobody. And his testimony was critical to convicting Manson because Manson wasn't at the scene of the Tate murders when they happened. So Manson was being charged with killing four or five people who he didn't, lay a finger on. And he wasn't even present in that. And that was one of Bugliosi's biggest challenges, was to convict Manson of conspiracy and being the one who ordered these murders. So to do that, he had to have all his puzzle pieces in place. And the biggest one was, well, why did he send those people to that house in particular? And Bugliosi said because Manson had this hatred for Melcher, because Melcher had led Manson on to believe that he'd record him and then didn't. What I thought was there was a lot. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the theory in Helter Skelter motif, or Bugliosi's motif, was partly the racial war motif and partly the envy, the jealousy, or the revenge. The revenge towards the music producer Melcher was. He was part of the Beach Boys crowd and whatever. But according to your book, the Melcher testimony was filled with lies. He committed perjury.
Right. Because Melcher, testified that he had, in fact, auditioned the group. He had gone out to the Spahn Ranch and listened to Manson perform with the girls singing in the background. And he said he just wasn't impressed and politely told Manson he didn't think he'd be right for his label that he was starting, but that he might be an interesting subject for a documentary and that he was going to send a friend of his who was a documentary filmmaker to meet him. And then he testified that he had never seen Manson again. And this was about 2 months before the murders occurred. What I found out once I got access to police files was that, in fact, Melcher continued seeing Manson after the murders. And there I had evidence, documents showing that Manson had been out to the Spahn Ranch and in one episode had fallen on his knees, crying and begging Manson for forgiveness for something. And Manson said to Melcher, they all had to die. All the piggies had to die. Now, difficulty for someone like me is, like you say, it's an old case. So the person who told this story to the police, Paul Watkins, was now dead. So I couldn't ask him why Terry was asking forgiveness. Forgiveness for what? And the cop who had taken the report, now I can't remember if he was dead or if I could never find him, but I couldn't get anyone to corroborate that. I only had the paperwork. But the paperwork's pretty important because it's from the actual investigation. So I found lots of documents like that. And I was able to corroborate from other interviews with other people that the police had that Melcher had been to the ranch during that same week. It was the first week of September, which is a month after the murders. And then again, he had gone out to Death Valley, which is a really difficult place to get to, especially in their, what they call the Barker Ranch, where the Manson had family had moved to in September, the whole group had gone to Death Valley to hide in the mountains. And Melcher had gone there too to see Manson.
I'm going to stop you again. Can you say that, is it plausible to say that all during this time before the murders, there were a lot of things happening with Manson or things Manson did that where law enforcement saw the other way? Or
looked the other way.
It looked the other way. Sorry, my English.
Yeah.
But either he or his followers, the girls, Susan Atkins, Kasabian, Krenwinkel, and all the other girls, they were doing stuff that would have consequences for normal people,
right,
which never came into effect. Partly because of strange incidents with parole officers, which we don't have in Norway in the same degree, or other instances of law enforcement that was inconsistencies all the ways, or irregularities, in discrepancies. Why on earth didn't they do this when they did that, or whatever? Right. And that raised your eyebrows. And I just have to state for the record again, you didn't go into this project as actively seeking to prove some conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. But you saw these documents, a lot of documents. You filed for, I don't remember what you call it. You filed for
Freedom of Information Act requests.
Freedom of Information Act, and it just piled on and on and on. Like, why didn't people or law enforcement or the government, why didn't they react in a different way towards these people when they act in a very strict way towards all other people? They get leniency. Can you say that? Is that the crux of the case in your eyes?
And just so your listeners know, I mean, even when I filed all these official requests, I wasn't getting the answers that way. I usually got what they call a neither confirm nor deny this answer. I kind of wore down some retired cops and retired people in law enforcement who decided to help me. So my first big break was the sheriff's department, which also was part of the investigations of the murders. A couple of the retired sheriffs there who I've been going to see and interview, I think they were more impressed by my dedication. And they also, none of them liked Bugliosi. And they all knew that because they witnessed this. They knew Bugliosi had lied. They knew Bugliosi had an author in the courtroom with him while he was trying the case, because he saw it as his way out of the DA's office and into fame and power and money. So they told me, they gave me access to the sheriff's file on Manson, which had never been before or since open to anyone. And all they did was call up another retired guy who worked at the barracks at the academy where the sheriffs are trained, where all the files were kept. And they said I'd be coming over at a certain time. He should let me in the back door and show me where they were. So that's how I got my first important batch of documents. It was all unofficial access. And then the LAPD, it was similar. I found the homicide detective in charge of just the Tate murders. And first he tried to sell me, he had copied or had the original entire file on me. And at that point, he was living out in Sun Valley, Utah, right next door to Demi Moore and Bruce Willis, who were married in a big house. And he was trying to sell me his collection, I think I can't remember if he gave me a figure, but he implied $50,000 to $100,000, which obviously I didn't have. He finally moved from there back to Palm Springs. And after 3 or 4 years of visiting him, talking to him, drinking a lot with him and his wife, he finally said, "Oh, what the hell?" He goes, "You can go through everything I have in exchange for filing it and organizing it for me because I want to do a book." And I said, "And can I copy everything?" And he said, yeah, just go down the street to Kinko's and come back with it. And I spent about a week or two at his house in his garage going through everything. So that's how I got all my smoking guns, or the most of them. You know, did have to go other places, to get more, but nothing was easy, I guess I should say.
So for the listeners again, let's recap again. You get the magazine story, feature article assignment from Premiere Magazine about writing a more or less bland story about the 30 years anniversary. and you start looking into Helter Skelter, the motif, Bugliosi's prosecution, his book, and you see discrepancies. Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day, is one of the first people that you see that it's something really wrong here.
Yeah.
And you end up on this kind of a slippery slope or down the rabbit hole. Can you say that?
Yeah.
Because the next guys on my list are the Smiths.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you have to go back in time a bit into San Francisco, Ashbury Heights.
Yeah.
Can you tell me who are the Smiths?
Yeah. So Roger Smith.
Not the band.
Yeah. Well, I talked about Roger Smith earlier. He was Manson's parole officer, who was a PhD student in criminology at Berkeley in 1967. And he was the one who kind of became Manson's. Well, Manson nicknamed him after a character in a book called Stranger in a Strange Land, which is about a Martian that comes to Earth and becomes very much like Manson, forms a communal group of mostly women followers, and they want to basically wipe out the population of the Earth so that this Martian can take over with his followers. I mean, it's a model for what Manson did. And the person in the book, in the fictional book that protected this character, was called Jubal. He was a lawyer. So Manson and his followers called Roger Jubal because he was always getting them out of trouble, not just him, but the girls. Every time they got in trouble, he would pull strings behind the scenes to let them remain free, when in fact his job was the opposite of that. He was supposed to be monitoring and then punishing them. So that was Roger Smith. He moved from the parole office to drug research at the same time he was supervising Manson, and eventually stopped working in parole except for with Manson as his only client. And
just to stop you 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Just to clarify, to drop down to one parolee, that's pretty rare.
Very rare, yeah. He was phasing.
Because
he was phasing out. He hit about, I think, 30, and by the end of 68, he had won. And
that was Charles Manson.
Yeah, and he had moved.
And that in itself is very strange.
Yeah, yeah. And he had moved to the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which was opened by David Smith, a doctor who was no relation to Roger, but about the same age. He was a medical student, graduated, got his MD, and he opened a free clinic to cater to the invasion of hippies and young kids into the Haight in the summer of 67. That was supposed to be a place that anybody could go for free medical attention, which they needed because kids were, having drug overdoses, freaking out. They also were getting venereal diseases, getting pregnant. But
because just to clarify, Ashbury Heights, how do you say it?
Haight-Ashbury.
Haight-Ashbury, that was the epicenter of the hippie culture in the whole United States.
Right. The center. Yeah.
Continue. Please continue.
Yeah, so he opened it in June of 67, and he basically lied, and he got caught in the lie a few years later. Again, not by me first, but by me more extensively. He had claimed in order to get government funding and also private donations, because you need money to run a medical clinic, that all he would be doing would be taking care of these kids because there was no one else there to take care of them, and no research. But he was a research scientist, and everybody working there were researchers. And it turned out they were getting tons of government money to do this secret research on the kids coming in there. And Roger Smith, Manson's parole officer, was doing the same thing. He was doing a drug program research there. So the Smiths ran that clinic. And then in the spring of 68, when Manson moved down south to Los Angeles, a bunch of girls went north to a place called Mendocino, about 2 hours north of San Francisco, which was a very rural, beautiful kind of oceanside. Mostly it was farms for fruits and wineries and stuff like that. But a lot of hippie communes were kind of sprouting up there. Manson sent the girls there to recruit more people for his group. 3 or 4 of them got arrested. And during that period, even more unusual things happened with Roger Smith. He went up there and number one, petitioned the local court to become guardian with his wife of one of the girl's babies. Pooh Bear was the name of the baby. And that was actually Manson's firstborn child with the family. So Roger Smith's parole officer really blurred the lines because now he's actually the foster parent of Manson's son until she got out of prison. And that took about 4 months. And the reason she was released and the two other women were released, they were convicted. And the judge had to decide whether to send them to prison or to give them another chance. But if they get the other chance, they have to be on probation. Probation is different from parole. Parole means you're released from prison after you've done a certain amount of time. You're still supervised when you're released, but you've done time. Probation means you're convicted of a crime. Usually it's your first crime or it's something that's not that serious. And rather than serve your time, you're given a chance to be free as long as you live by the guidelines. Well, all three women were given probation leniency, and each of the judge released them based on, in part, on Roger Smith's recommendation that these women shouldn't be confined to jail. They're all good women. He never disclosed to the judge or the court that they were actually working on behalf of his main parole client, Charles Manson, to recruit people for their group, and that Manson them all into criminals. I mean, and Smith was like the master manipulator of the whole thing.
But these guys, the Smiths, they were not hippie lovers from the beginning. They were Republicans.
Well, it's hard to say, but Roger described himself to me as a rock rib Republican from Iowa. Yeah, he was very traditional, and he came out of, still to this day. Well, till recently he retired. He worked for the federal government. David Smith kind of was a hippie. He went through a real drug phase. He was searching. But he became part of the establishment because he needed to in order to get all the money he was getting. He actually lost his position. He ran the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic for a little less than 50 years, but what's never really been reported outside of San Francisco, and he's a giant there historically because he opened this clinic. Everybody knows him, Dr. Dave, they call him. But in 2007 or 8, he was removed from the clinic by the board of directors because they found out that for years he'd been embezzling money that was supposed to be for the clinic. So he agreed to leave the board if they didn't file a civil lawsuit against him.
You do not speculate a lot in your book, and that's one of the reasons I really like it, that you restrain yourself from speculating, because if I wrote the book, I would start speculating about even more crazy stuff than you do. But one thesis you put out there, or one question you propose, is why on earth did the Smiths hang out in a Haight-Ashbury and do all this work? What was their motif? What was their agenda?
That's where I got to be careful because I don't want to speculate. But I mean, the larger thesis of the book is I paint a circumstantial picture of the possibility that Manson was groomed from the time he was released from prison, or even before he was released, to be part of kind of the American intelligence's weapon against the left-wing movement that was rising and on the verge of a revolution. So Manson was released in 1967 in California. And at the time we had Lyndon Johnson as the president, who was, he was actually going to announce within a year that he wasn't running for re-election because he could not stop the war and he couldn't stop the youth revolution that was really, they were right up against the gates of the White House protesting. And then we had J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, who was a staunch right-wing kind of fascist. We had Richard Helms, who was the head of the CIA. And then we had in California, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. Sam Yorty was the mayor of Los Angeles. That group of guys were like a right-wing cabal. And in 1967, Richard Helms of the CIA opened his first office of counterintelligence on American soil called Chaos in San Francisco. And the aim of Chaos was to infiltrate the left-wing movement and do whatever it could to neutralize it. Hoover, the exact same year, spring of 1967, reignited something called COINTELPRO, which was Counterintelligence Program, an acronym, which had actually begun in the 40s to combat the Ku Klux Klan. And then once the early 60s happened and most of the Klan had been put under control, it was kind of put out of use. But he reopened it in 1967, and it had the exact same modus operandi and objective of Chaos, which was to infiltrate using agents and plants groups that were, they thought, a threat to the United States. Reagan had to agree to allow them to do it in the state, and he did. Yorty had to agree to allow them to do it in Los Angeles. LBJ lost the election. Richard Nixon, who was much more right-wing than anyone, became president. And at that point, Manson had become, by 1969, a weapon. He was weaponized. My theory, which I don't think I've proven, but I think I present a pretty compelling case, was that Manson was watched and provoked and manipulated to do exactly what the COINTELPRO and Chaos were trying to do, which was to smear the left wing and make them look out of control, dangerous, unpredictable. And I make a pretty good case, I think, in the book, in the latter half of the book, of different people who've never been affiliated with Manson or the group, who are all working in intelligence, kind of intersecting with Manson and the group, especially in Los Angeles. And during the time leading up to the murders, the sheriff's department was actually surveilling the ranch for 3 months. They knew Manson's comings and goings. They knew everything he was doing. He was still getting arrested and released. And when you talk about the documents I found, I was still doubting everything that I was starting to allow myself to think possible. And one of the big turning points was probably about 2002, like 2 or 3 years after. I brought just Manson's parole records, his arrest records and his release records, to a retired district attorney named Louis Watnick, to his home. And I said to him, tell me if this is just an anomaly or incompetence, because bureaucracies are bureaucracies. They make mistakes. But I look at these records, and here's their timeline, and look at who this guy was, and tell me what you think. So Lou Watnick goes through the whole stack of papers. It took him like an hour. And he looks at the papers and he goes, this is all chicken shit. It's all chicken shit. I'm like, what are you saying? And he is saying, 1 or 2 instances of Manson getting arrested and then being allowed to stay free, I might look at as incompetence or just like a lazy parole officer. He goes, but there's a pattern here. It never, ever would happen this much unless somebody wanted him out. And he said he was more valuable to someone, some agency outside than he was inside. And I'm like, well, what agency?
I'm going to stop you again. Because this is what I really want to delve into. This is the meat of the story as far as I'm concerned. But I just want to provide some context, or I want you to help me to provide some context. After the Korean War, the term thought reform is hitting American radars. It's actually a Chinese concept developed by Mao and his cronies, Kang Sheng and the Chinese Communist intelligence services, more or less inspired by Soviet Union and NKVD and all the intelligence services of Stalin. And the Americans were in a constant conflict with the Eastern world, the communist world, and they saw these guys are really effective at what they're doing and controlling the masses. I don't know who said it. Maybe it was in your book or in Seymour Hersh's book, but what some government officials said. Who wouldn't want to control all the population? Of course, we want to do that, even if we're United States. So we're in the 50s. The Chinese are really effective what they're doing. They're controlling a huge population, doing their bidding, crashing old monasteries, turning the society upside down. They say, if we're going to compete with these guys, we need to get on the level the playing field somewhat. But since we're a democracy and freedom and individualism and everything is part of the American texture or the American way of life, we can't do it the Mao way. We cannot like control all the arts. We cannot control all the politics down to minuscule levels. We have to do it in a different way. Enter Albert Hoffman, the Swiss scientist, LSD, other ways of controlling the human mind. Is that a fair assessment of the political picture? Mm-hmm. Can you fill in? You want to add something to that analysis?
Yeah, well, I mean, the CIA began MK Ultra as what they said was a defensive program to defend
just
against.
For the record, sorry, just to clarify, MK Ultra stands for.
It's just an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything. But
it's not mind control.
Well, yeah, it was a research program initiated by Allen Dulles, who was the CIA head in 1952, and Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of technical services at the CIA, which was their science division. And they initiated it to learn how to prevent American soldiers, citizens from being brainwashed by the other side. And,
the Chinese.
Yeah, Chinese and Russians, if they're captured, in a war or that kind of thing. Then when they realized that it could be very effective, it became offensive. They realized they could create couriers, in other words, who could cross enemy lines, deliver messages, and then be amnesic of the message after they delivered it. Ultimately, what they wanted to do was to develop the technology to create what became known as Manchurian candidates. There was a popular fiction book or nonfiction book called The Manchurian Candidate that came out in
the movie.
Well, before the movie, it was a book by Richard Condon, and it came out, I think, in 60 or 61, and it's about the United States government developing, using servicemen as guinea pigs, as experimental assassins, where they were hypnotized and drugged and given subconscious triggers where if they would see or hear something, they would automatically kill someone or it would be directed, but they'd be amnesic of the programming of that. So that was basically kind of in a nutshell MK Ultra. They also wanted to learn how to do things like induce insanity in a person without their awareness. That's why Sidney sent agents over to Cuba to infiltrate Fidel Castro's inner circle. They were trying to get Castro to smoke a cigar with LSD and other drugs. Yeah. He'd flip out and that kind of thing. So that was this program. Pardon me?
No, like Joe Pesci said in the JFK movie, maybe we can make a cigar with drugs that make his beer fall off. You saw the JFK movie.
I forgot about that, yeah. And he would have thought of that because he played David Ferry, who didn't have any hair.
Yeah.
Did
you ever... No, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Now, did you ever encounter David Ferry, or he was dead, but did you ever research... I know you researched Jack Ruby, but did you
David Ferry came up. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information out there that Ruby had, connections with Ferry and that group. I really, for the purposes of my book, just tried to focus on Ruby and his relationship with Jolly West. I didn't want to go into any of the single bullet, all that kind of other peripheral stuff, because there are people much more educated about that than me.
Yeah, now we're doing what you tried not to do in your book, to diverge into 1,000. So let's just rewind a bit again, and for clarity say that whatever was happening with Manson and his alleged possible ties to the CIA and the MK Ultra program. Everything has to do with a war, maybe a secret war, an invisible war with the communists, with the Chinese and the Russians. This is like the pretext. It's not for the sole purpose of controlling the U.S. citizens. It's to control the U.S. citizens as a means of reaching it in a battle with the East.
The battle with the East, and then they turned it, I think, on citizens here. Yeah. And I mean, it was an illegal program to begin with because, number one, you're not allowed to give citizens in the United States drugs without their consent. And the drugs were being experimented on with patients in psychiatric clinics, people at service bases, military people. And then they actually went out into the population. In San Francisco and New York, they created what they called safe houses. And in the mid-60s, they had something called Operation Climax, where they decorated apartments to look like bordellos. And these...
Midnight Climax.
What did I say? Midnight Climax, sorry. And the prostitutes would lure Johns, who are, potential guys to pay for sex, up to these apartments and then either dose their drink with LSD, or they were trying to see if they could use aerosol to put it in the air to give them. And then the scientists were behind two one-way mirrors watching everything and studying the reactions to the druggings. So this was going on for at least 20 years, from 52 to 72. And it was also illegal because the CIA is not allowed to operate on American soil. It's barred U.S. law. At that time, when it was discontinued in the early 70s, it was the most expensive operation the CIA had ever conducted. And what I found, and this is back to chaos in the book, is there was a doctor at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic named Jolly West who had been accused of being involved in MK Ultra when this whole program was exposed by Seymour Hersh and another guy named John Marks in the mid-70s. And West was a very prominent psychiatrist. At that point, he was at UCLA running their psychiatry and neuroscience departments. And he denied ever having anything to do with the CIA. Now, in a weird coincidence, his name starts popping up when I was looking at what happened to Manson in San Francisco, specifically what happened to him at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, where he was going to see Roger weekly, sometimes more than once a week, for his parole appointments. And I found out that this Jolly West was there. Well, by coincidence, I had interviewed Jolly West 5 years before his name surfaced in my research for a story I had done at magazines, another magazine about people who are obsessed with celebrities to the point where they stalk and kill them. And he was an expert in that. Like, he wasn't anything really to do with violence and kind of mental illness. Hypnosis, yeah. So I looked into, I had interviewed him and not even transcribed the tape because he wasn't interesting and nice. And I had much more interesting other interviews, but I started looking into him and I found out he had just died, about a year before I got the assignment. And I was just about to say not of murder or old age, but he actually was murdered by his son, who confessed later that it was a mercy killing, that Jolly and his wife were both terminally ill, and the son gave them overdoses of drugs to kill them. It was by their wish. Anyway, Jolly was at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic recruiting subjects for research. And when I saw that he had been affiliated or accused of being involved in Ultra, I thought, wow, that's even more interesting, because he would have had access to Manson, and look at what Manson became and the girls became. So I took a really big leap of faith and called up UCLA, where I had actually interviewed him in his office, and where he worked until he retired as an emeritus professor, and asked them whether or not he had left any papers to them, which is usually what a professor does, especially he'd been there since 69. So he'd been there so long. And sure enough, they said they had his entire collection but it hadn't been processed yet. And I asked, well, could it be processed? And they said, well, we'll put in a request. And I said, how long will it take? And they said, oh, it could be anywhere from 6 months to a year before we start releasing any of it, because we have to look at every document. Also, since he was a medical, they had to make sure there weren't patient files in there. So I can't remember how I got them to do it, but they agreed to kind of expedite it. And within a few weeks, they started releasing a box to me at a time. So I'd go to the library and their special collections department where, you have to go through security and sign in, and then you're in a room and you're brought out a box at a time. And then there are people who are watching. You have to wear gloves because a lot of the documents are old. And to make a long story short, I spent the entire summer there, going almost every day from like 9 a.m. till 5 p.m, going through box after box, looking for a needle in a haystack, thinking that there must be something in here showing that he has either a link to Manson or to MK Ultra. And I found it. And I still can't believe I found it, but it was a misfile. He obviously didn't intend for it to be there, but it was a bunch of letters between him and Sidney Gottlieb, the founder of MK Ultra, dating back to 52, 53, where they basically planned the whole secret program. So the most important thing was this showed that West had lied to everyone in the 70s when he was accused of this. I mean, I have about 10 or 20 different news reports where he's asked by reporters, and he laughs and says, oh, they approached me. And I said, you can't control people with LSD. It's crazy, because I would never do anything like that. Well, not only did he do it, he kind of created the blueprint for it. One of the letters is about 10 pages long, and he outlines his objectives with Gottlieb, which is to create fugues and amnesias in people, to get people to do things and have no recollection of their programming. And this is a later document, 55, where he announced that he had developed the technology to remove a true memory from a human being and replace it with a false memory, so much so that it would be fixed for the rest of their lives, and they would be amnesic of his involvement in doing that, which is a pretty powerful...
Like the movie, like Inception, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah, yeah.
So to zoom out for 2 seconds again, we have the murder of the century, a bully, or what do you call it, a serial felon, is making his cult members murder movie director, a movie star wife, and some random people, LaBiancas. And the main narrative is that he's a crazy guy, learned some guru skills in prison, which is more or less inconceivable if he didn't have any really professional help. And the main narrative is that this is one guy's megalomaniac prophecy about racial war. At the same time, there are a lot of strange characters revolving around this milieu. It's spooks, as you call it, CIA agents. We have Reese Whitson, different kind of strange cops selling drugs. It's a lot of strange things going on. I think even in the book, you imply that either the singers of the Mamas and the Papas either was a CIA asset or was involved in some low level. Maybe she was used. Maybe she was a useful idiot. I don't know. But there was too much strange things going on to suggest that the main motive of Bugliosi's book held any water. And if you also then look at what happened in 8 Ashbury with the Smiths, and also their connection to Jolly West and his connection to Sidney Gottlieb, which is evidently the guy who started the MK Ultra program under Richard Helms. This is proven, right, by the church commission. It was nothing you rip. You didn't rip this from the Alex Jones show. This is documented. It was a break-in. in the building.
There were congressional hearings, and if you have my book, you have the 60 pages of endnotes at the back, where I have all the the pages, reference pages for the testimony, the news, everything I refer to in the book, I have the source material in the back of the book. And you don't get that if you get the audio book. So I actually prefer people to get the print book.
Yeah. So it's very important to just press the issue that you are not a conspiracy theorist. You were an entertainment journalist stumbling upon something really, really coincidental, a lot of discrepancy.
Right.
And what it amounts to is that it's too much inconsistencies to trust the main narrative. There has to be something going on, even though you maybe have to admit you didn't crack the case wide open at the end of the book. You didn't connect all the dots. You didn't prove, for instance, that next Jolly book. West and next book. But there's too much smoke to be
I agree.
Not any fire here. So what are you suggesting? That Manson was a CIA asset?
No, I'm only suggesting that there's a possibility that all of this stuff was done by design. And at the very least, the government was knowledgeable of things that were happening as they were happening and before they happened, and still being kept from us. And, the book ends with my story about trying to get these audio tapes of Tex Watson, the main killer, describing his relationship with the group, how he met them, and the night and the murders and why they happened. And I discovered that these existed in 2009, I think. That's a long story. Maybe people should just read it. But in a nutshell, once I found out what was there and tried to get it, I was the DA's office got involved here in Los Angeles in the LAPD. And they actually went to court to get these tapes from the trustee of the dead lawyer who had them in Texas. It's complicated. And when they won, they were able to win with my help because I was giving them information that the lawyer had told me was on these tapes. And their promise to me was I would be the first one to listen to the tapes as soon as they got them. It took about 3 years for them to get them. As soon as they got them, I was shown to be the fool I am. They completely cut me off, locked down the tapes. And that was 2013, I think. And now we're in 2020. No one's heard the tapes except them. And these are the first audio tapes, accounts of Manson and the group made before anyone knew who Manson was, except for law enforcement. The public didn't know yet. They were made before Susan Atkins told a similar story, but what I think was written by the DA's office, because at that point they had, and this is all in the book, removed her corner-pointed attorney and replaced him with a DA, a former DA, to manipulate her. So I think what I'm hoping, one of the things that the book I was hoping to do with it, is kind of force all this stuff out into the light by presenting my argument. And luckily, fingers crossed, there's a woman here in Los Angeles who is working on an op-ed for the LA Times that she wanted to wait till the election was over before she ran it, demanding that these tapes finally be released because it's the only piece of evidence, as far as we know, that has never been released in relation to this case. And I think they're not released because they have all the answers. They show the fraud, they show what the police knew and everything.
But let's play detectives for a moment, because when somebody gets murdered, most detectives would say 90% it's a close relative. It's a husband, or it's a girlfriend, or it's not blind violence on the street. If you understand my analogy, like in my perception, Bugliosi's thesis about Helter Skelter, that's the blind violence theory. It's like it's a random guy with some strange ideas killing some random people. Mm-hmm. But let's hypothesize about motives here. What will be the motives by the intelligence community to either manipulate Manson, to manipulate the girls and Tex Watson to do it, or pull the strings or look the other way? For me, the motives are quite clear. You could, if you read the John Ehrlichman interview in Harper's Magazine before he died about Nixon administration's crackdown on drugs, he said blatantly that all they did was overtly with the intent to stop the civil rights movement, Vietnam descendants. They were doing all the policies they were doing in this regard was with the sole intention of opposing these movements in the United States.
Yeah.
And if I understand your book correctly, or my reading of it, it's the motive, if we would suggest that it's a conspiracy here, or something fishy going on at least, it would be to do what J. Edgar Hoover and other guys were known to do, like sow dissent, make Black Panthers kill each other, make different Black civil rights movements guys incite violence towards each other. And in this instance, it would be, on one hand, to show the media how awful hippies were and how violent and druggy and sex fanatics, and to kind of spin the narrative about the whole hippie movement. And the other objective would be to sow unrest and to make like parallel to what we saw with the alleged Russian campaign against the 2060 elections, to like just incite chaos, to be to be poignant. Is that a fair?
That's exactly what I'm trying to present. Yeah.
And the links between these guys, the Roger Smith, David Smith, Jolly West, who was linked to Sidney Gottlieb, the inventor or the guy behind MK Ultra on the CIA payroll. That's not to be denied. That's 100%.
Oh yeah,
you cannot get around that fact.
Right.
Sidney Gottlieb was a guy who invented MK Ultra, and for just to clarify, he also used this on. We know they used this on Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. He went through that program. We know that.
Well, that's not been proven. I don't think that he was a product of MK Ultra.
No, not a product, but that he was. They tried to brainwash him when he was at Harvard. Isn't that more or less proven?
I didn't know that it was, but you might know more about it than me because I haven't looked.
Okay.
To it, but
yeah. Besides the point, anyway.
Yeah.
MK Ultra is not. It's not 5G leading to Corona.
Yeah.
You can't compare those two. This is like Tonkin Bay, My Lai massacre. This is proven. This is congressional senators.
Yeah.
People know this shit is going on.
Yeah.
And these people who were associated with or behind these programs, like Sidney Gottlieb, were connected to at least Jolly West. And Jolly West was around in this milieu. But you were never able to establish that Jolly West and Manson actually had something to do with each other.
That they were in the same room.
They were in the same room. You know that.
No, I wasn't able to establish that. But
no.
Yeah, I mean, the closest I got was, I interviewed the majority of the staff of the clinic that worked there. And all of them said, well, everyone knew Charlie because Charlie came here almost every day, not just to see Roger, but he brought the girls there for their treatments. And, they were a fixture here. And for Jolly not to have seen them, encountered them, it would have been really unusual because he was here that whole summer too. But I can't know. I was hoping one thing I always wanted to find was some kind of piece of paper with West's name on it and with Manson or one of the girls.
Would you be happy to bet your money that?
Yeah.
Manson.
Well, I bet 20 years of my life. Yeah, I bet.
That's money.
Yeah. Not knowing if I was ever going to publish the book, I believed enough in my gut that was the case. And that's why I kept pushing and pushing. And, I had a lot of obstacles. One of my publishers, the first publisher, canceled the project and then they sued me for a return of the advance.
Penguin?
Penguin. And I worked with a great filmmaker, Errol Morris, who would have rescued me from liberty and gotten my story out there in a huge way. But then I didn't trust the way he wanted to tell the story. So I pulled away from that. And all of that was...
Yeah, because He went for the Frank Olson story.
Yeah, he went, which it has to be told, and I'm glad he did it. But when he originally and I began working together, our deal was I was going to be what they call the dedicated subject. So it was going to be a 4 to 5 hour Netflix series just on me. And in our first day of doing, when he filmed what they call the teaser reel, it had a huge, it was like a movie. They had, well, it was a movie. They had like 10 trucks. They took over 3 buildings in my complex. He wired my bungalow with cameras on everywhere. And during that interview, I started talking about the Frank Olson case because it's a very important, part of the history of MK Ultra. And he asked me, well, I mentioned that I knew Eric, through this. I become good friends with Eric, Frank's son. And he asked me if I would put him in touch with him. And I said, oh, yeah, sure. Eric would love to talk to you. And then within a month or so, all of a sudden, Errol had changed his concept and he wanted it to be a story about Eric's pursuit of the truth and my pursuit of the truth about a similar subject and then interweaving them. And I said, hey, Errol, you can tell Eric's story and I think you should, but I don't want to toll with mine because mine was still an unpublished manuscript. That was the basis of what he was doing. And I said, if I have to share it with another story, then it's no longer my story. And I go, do his thing, but I'm out, And he would about that. So
but even though you didn't go with, or Errol Morris didn't go with you, by the way, one of my favorite directors of all time, Errol Morris, I have to say. I watched The Wormwood. Yeah. He's a fantastic filmmaker. I watched the Frank Olson series, and even though you didn't go with it, it kind of corroborates your thesis, doesn't it? It's the same. It's the same swamp. Let's just say that.
Yeah. And someday off camera, I'll tell you the truth about the ending of Wormwood and your friend Seymour Hersh, who you saw in the last installment. But the truth was, I don't want to say too much of this on camera. I'll tell you more off if you want to talk about it. Probably not today, but at another point. Seymour Hersh had a lot more information that he withheld. And Errol and Eric knew it, and they couldn't get. I mean, there's a little bit of the back and forth with Errol trying to get him to say more, and he wouldn't. What he wouldn't say was explosive. And because he wouldn't say it, Eric and Seymour fell out, and Eric and Errol fell out because Eric wanted this at the end of the film, and Errol was too scared to put it in.
I have to ask you, even though you couldn't prove anything like unequivocally, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Have you started looking at other things through a different lens, like current affairs? Let's take an example.
I try not to because then you would lose your mind.
Let's take the Iraq War. Like, did you revisit the Iraq War and the?
Well, I mean, I already believe that the government had, misled the public about and the Senate about what they believed Saddam was doing over there, because they wanted us to go in there no matter what. But that didn't have anything to do with this, really. But everybody asked me if I think that MK Ultra is still operative, and even though they declared that they had ended it and stuff, and if you do think that they're still doing, I mean, I can't imagine they would have spent all that money and time and created that technology and then thrown it away. I mean, at the hearings, and this is a joke, but at the hearings, the CIA officials all testified that nothing they had done was worth it, that they didn't accomplish anything, they didn't learn anything. They actually allowed themselves to look pretty foolish. And I believe that that was all a cover so they could continue using this. But when I try to think about stuff that happens today through the lens of, well, wait, if our government has the power to even fundamentally change people's memories, it makes you question every school shooting, every mass this, mass that, and then you lose your mind. So I try just to, when I think about anything of this, I try to keep it focused just on the 50s, 60s, and mid 70s, reporting and doing research on a lot of the open-ended stuff in the book. And if I do another book or some other kind of media, like a documentary, even possibly a podcast, I want to present a lot of the stuff we didn't get into the book for space purposes, or because we didn't have enough documentation. I've got more documentation now, and I'm hoping to get more as time goes on. I don't want to stay in the subject forever, but we'll see.
But you had to be astonished when you realized that Jolly West, which is maybe not the main character of the book, but one of the antagonists or the really possibly evil guys who puts everything together, when you realized that he was actually Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, you must have been, what was the feeling in your gut? Was it like, wow, this is...
Well, it wasn't so, I mean, I knew when I was looking for evidence that West was an MK Ultra, that he had been Ruby's psychiatrist for a period of time, because that's all part of the history and public record. But when I found out in West's own writing that he was trying to learn how to induce insanity in someone without their knowledge, and then I got the timeline of how West got into the Ruby case and then what happened from the day one. I mean, West examined Ruby at the county jail in Dallas, and then he came out and had a little press conference and said, he announced that within the preceding 48 hours, Ruby had had a psychotic break from which he would never recover, that he was experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. And that's exactly what West had learned how to do. And Ruby hadn't yet told his story of why and how he shot Oswald. That was about to happen, and West got involved. And then when Ruby finally testified to the Warren Commission, he was incoherent. He was rambling about hearing Jewish kids boiled alive outside his cell. He took Arlen Specter aside and begged him to save him from the police who were exterminating Jews in the prison system, all this kind of crazy stuff. So,
at the same time, Alan Dulles was MK Ultra's benefactor.
Right? Yeah, and he was fired by John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy said he was gonna smash the CIA to smithereens. And then Alan Dulles was on the Warren Commission investigating, the Kennedy assassination when he's a suspect. The CIA was a suspect in the assassination officially because of Oswald's, what they thought was a peripheral relationship with the agency. And we'll never know because they're still not releasing the files on Oswald. And I don't think the CIA ever will.
Did you watch the JFK movie after you wrote the book?
Which one?
The Oliver Stone movie?
Oh, no, I watched it while I was writing the book because that came out, I think, in the 90s?
1991, I think.
Yeah, I've seen
because the scene with Donald Sutherland.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, that movie...
It reminds me of your book.
Yeah. The movie is so well made, and I've looked a lot into Jim Garrison and his case, and I think the problem with Oliver Stone's movie, and this is what I'm really scared about, because they're making my book into a movie that
I know.
He contrived scenes and conflated characters to make his story more persuasive. I don't think you can do that when you're accusing the United States government of murder. I don't think you can take artistic license. And unfortunately, that's my biggest fear of what might happen with my book, that they're going to bridges and events that didn't happen. And the screenwriter who's working on it is finished. And we're waiting to find out, number one, whether the studio is going to actually do it or continue developing it. But I haven't read the script yet, and I don't want to read it because I'm the protagonist. I'm too scared that they've done that, and I have no control or say once they own it, and they own it.
But while you were writing the book, big major stories about the intelligence community was breaking. When the Edward Snowden case was breaking, how did you react? What
Well, I immediately looked at what kind of stuff they were releasing and tried to find out if there was anything that went back as far as my period. And with Assange and Snowden, it didn't. So then I looked away from it because I didn't want to be distracted by anything current. You know, if it had nothing to do with what I was doing, I was already had way too many distractions. So I never really followed it that close. I'd read the headlines, the beginnings of the stories. Unless it applied to, unless I thought it could help what I was trying to report, I didn't want to know.
But how far do you think the CIA are willing to go in 2020? Which line would they ever cross in your?
Yeah, no, I become friendly just in the last month or two with a couple people who, one of them's a big deal guy who has contracts with the CIA, and I've been trying to ask him that and get answers from him. And another is an author who writes a lot about them. And both of them have pretty much said that they think that the CIA really is more like, they're much less powerful than they used to be, but that there's other agencies whose names we don't even know who are doing what the CIA was supposed to do. You probably know more about it than I do, because.
But don't you think these intelligence agencies? If you watched Michael Hayden was chief of the NSA after Snowden, he put forth a pretty compelling argument that Edward Snowden is the bad guy. We are doing everything we can to protect the country, and we cannot tell you everything we do because the world is a complex place, and sometimes we have to do really shady stuff. If we not do it, the world is going to be chaos. Do you buy that argument, or do you think we are?
I'm mixed. Sometimes I think yes, sometimes I think no, but I think there should be transparency as much as possible. I can't remember what Hayden was talking about when he said that. I mean, was he referring to specific operations or?
No, it was more like a philosophical argument. Like, we know what we're doing. We're protecting the American.
Yeah, no, I would not. Yeah, I would rather have no CIA than have to have a blind trust in something like that.
Like, for instance, killing Allende in Chile. Seymour Hersh reported on that. Like,
so you wonder how much of that is going on now, you know?
Yeah, how much of that is going on now? Do you have you thought about that, like during Corona crisis or the elections and the stuff going on? Like, do you think stuff's going on now that is comparable to what you've been almost at least able to disclose?
I have no knowledge, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Are you scared?
I have never been more frightened for the world or the country than the last 4 years, but that's a political thing on my part. I think he was more dangerous than anything. And, you know, if he's not, I don't know what he's going to do if they announce for Biden tonight, but he's not going to go down without a struggle. I think it's going to be a fascinating month or two to see what happens. But, frightened of his absolute power and the way he violated all kinds of constitutional norms, mostly for our country and our populations. But you put forth a compelling argument about Hoover and Helms inciting hatred amongst groups, polarizing the country and stuff. Isn't that just what we're seeing right now? Are you sure it's just? Oh, no, it's completely possible. I mean, when I look at the Black Lives Matter protests, the Antifa, all that kind of stuff, I'm sure that there are provocateurs. There are people who are pushing stuff, the plants, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And you think maybe intelligence is involved?
Pardon me?
It's plausible to say that intelligence may be involved in polarization.
Yeah.
And
I mean, just because I know that it had been for so long, and again, my research only went to the early 70s, but I know from the 40s and 50s until the early 70s when I got access, I mean, the files I have access to and the people and stuff, I mean, it's proven that, you know, these people government people with the blessing and the allegiance of the government were infiltrating and provoking people to commit crimes and committing crime themselves, including, murder, killing panthers and stuff like that. I would just almost assume it's still happening. It's to what degree? I don't know. I mean, after Church and after Rockefeller and all those commissions, there were all these supposed safeguards put into place to prevent that from happening. But, I don't know whether any of them were.
Have you gotten any rebukes like Tom O'Neill, the conspiracy theorist, crazy Tom O'Neill, anything like that?
Only from readers. We're amazed. Myself, my publisher, my agent, my collaborator, we haven't gotten a single threat of a lawsuit, because there are a lot of people, not party, but there's at least a dozen people, the Smiths, beginning with the Smiths, Lawrence Schiller, who are still alive, who could sue me for defamation, but I'm sure they won't, because number one, I have everything backed up, and number two, if they do, we have a process called discovery. And if they sued me, they would be obligated to release shit to me that I asked for through the courts, and they're not going to want to do that. I mean, even Vince Bugliosi, who's been dead for 5 years, a lot of people think I waited till he died, because I was frightened of him suing me. And I knew he was going to sue me, but it's more important to me that he be alive, because I wanted him to answer to this stuff. And I was devastated when he died, not because I cared about him, but because I thought, now he's gotten away with it because he's not going to be alive. I've got all this information. I'm the only one that's ever asked it to him. And if you read the book, especially at the end, you see what he did when I asked him. Well, I wanted millions of reporters, or at least local Los Angeles reporters, to ask him those questions and see how he handled it. But I was also told by my publisher when we were doing the fact checking of the book that I shouldn't think that I'm immune from Bugliosi for prosecution, because his wife, who runs now his estate, she could have sued us, because we made her book possibly less valuable. Her husband's book, and she is now the beneficiary of that. So she could have sued me on behalf of the book and the estate, and she didn't do that. So no, there hasn't been a single. Nobody's even called me that I interviewed to say they were upset. And that shocked me.
Does that strengthen your conviction? Does that strengthen your conviction that you're onto something?
Yeah. I did think like, oh God, there's going to be something in there that I got wrong, and they're going to be able to diminish it and come up with something to counter it. But I said I would live with that because it was too important to get as much out as I could. But yeah, it definitely strengthens my conviction that everything is right. And I think a lot of the stuff that I only hint at or present as a possibility is more likely than not right.
Blunt question. How far do you feel it's okay for the intelligence community to go, especially against their own citizens? What is too far?
Oh, I don't think citizens should be spied on, lied to, manipulated, drugged. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't mind. Some of the drugs are fun, as long as they told me they were giving it to me before I did it.
Magic mushrooms.
Yeah.
Last question. Zoom out again. 2020. The media today. Do you think there are any real important stories being broken, like Seymour Hersh type stories, Woodward Bernstein? Or, in my view, it's a lot of noise and very little signal. But maybe you know more than I do.
Right now, I'm a little tunnel vision-y on just the politics of the country. And I think that once Trump is out of the White House, that there is going to be a plethora of people coming forward and talking about crimes committed by him and the administration. And I would love to do that reporting myself, but I think it's only going to take reporters who have already got the contacts and stuff to do it. But I think there's a lot of great investigative reporting still to come about the last administration.
But aren't you, you don't have any concerns about Trump being kind of for as bad as a guy, he's a bad guy, don't get me wrong, but you're not concerned that he might be kind of a light rod to take the focus away from more important stuff, like what's happening on a larger scale behind closed doors with intelligence communities and stuff like Assange and Snowden has discovered? Like, of course, Trump is a bad guy. It's easy to point fingers at him.
You're saying is he a distraction?
Maybe. I'm just putting up the thesis.
Because anything's possible. I don't know about that. Anything's possible. I look at it much more fundamentally, and maybe that's my naivety, that it's all just about power and economics. I mean, the Republican Party, who's controlled the Senate for the last 4 years, Mitch McConnell and those guys, they all know, what a criminal Trump is. But all they cared about was getting their federal judges on the bench and on the Supreme Court so they can continue to basically minimize and downsize human rights, environmental restrictions, all the kind of stuff that they needed a kind of useful dummy in there, do all that. So, I mean, my interest, I hate to say it, but it's more local. It's more like, what is that administration done to the earth and to civil rights, human rights? The last justice that Trump got onto the court now just changes the balance and everything. And if he's able to stay in office, it's because he's taking this to the Supreme Court. He's already said it. And I'm not so cynical that I don't think I have more faith in the Supreme Court than he does. I don't think that even though he appointed the last three, that he's going to be successful getting them to uphold his administration and say he won and he was cheated. But yeah, I'm really much more kind of in a tube right now because I am so involved in the last year of the campaign and everything has been so crazy. And I was really wishing I could get out there and report on it. But I mean, there's so many people trying to who have much better context than I. So instead, I'm just keeping back and doing my old research to try to answer some questions that I wasn't able to answer.
So you're not like me concerned that the monolithic focus on Trump is like the modern Helter Skelter motif.
You're talking about globally?
No, but like all the focus on like how bad the Trump administration is. For all its faults, it's just been 4 years. They haven't bombed Cambodia. They haven't invaded Iraq. I'm just concerned there is a possibility that this is the modern Helter Skelter motif. It's like it's almost as crazy as Helter Skelter motif, even. Like
I've never thought about it that way. I'm going to have to rethink it. I think.
Yeah. We think, but last question. What would you say to readers of news and makers of news, journalists, and the public in regards to how skeptical they should be of the main narrative of the mainstream media? Like, of course, you can go too far with conspiracies and I don't know all the words for it, but you can also be too lenient towards the government. What is? You got to be careful. Approach?
I don't know what the media is like in your country. I do know here, and again, I hate to keep bringing it back to Trump. He's caused so much damage by making people not believe in facts, and with my book in particular. And you saw, I maintain throughout that I try not to be a conspiracy theorist. I think the most dangerous thing is I get emails, emails, messages, all kinds of contacts every day from people who've read my book or seen Rogan. And they're asking me, how did I miss this? Or don't I know that? And when I ask them for their source, it's stuff that they pull off the internet. And they don't have the knowledge, wisdom, foresight to understand that most of that stuff isn't vetted. It's, and that happens every day. People wanting to believe in conspiracies so much. And that's why it took me 20 years to write the book. Believe me, I would have loved to connect dots and even without the proof, but I couldn't do it, because and my agent always said that I was my book's worst enemy. He said, you're never going to finish because every time you have something new that you've come across that advances your theory, you have to disprove it first to yourself before you'll believe it. And that takes a lot of time. And I said, yeah, but that's the biggest compliment you could ever give me, as I kind of surround it and make sure that it's accurate and that it couldn't be something. When I found Jolly West papers at UCLA, I was really excited because that was a smoking gun. But my first thought was, and this is how I think, is it possible that these were planted by the Scientology church? Because he was a huge enemy of theirs. He had spoken publicly against them and being a cult, and they had demonstrated against him. And I know Scientologists are just as nefarious as the CIA. So my first goal after finding them was to authenticate them. And that's why I brought them, I think there's a little bit in the book, to John Marks, who was a State Department whistleblower who first found the CIA and MK Ultra documents. I didn't feel comfortable until he told me, oh no, this is definitely Gottlieb West. Everything in here rings true. There's no way you could make this up. But that's how I worked through the whole time. Like if I got excited or found anything out, first I tried to disprove it before I would believe it. And the problem nowadays, I think, is people do the opposite. They want to cherry pick and not look at the opposing information. And I think Trump has really used that to get as far as he's gotten.
Is it like Seymour Hersh always said, you have to be able to prove that your mother loves you? Isn't that one of his...
Prove that your mother loves you?
Yeah, that was... He in his book, he writes that he learned that very early when he was not a beat cop, but a street reporter. Like if you're gonna get a story printed, you have to prove that your mother loves you.
I haven't read his memoirs. I'll have to look at that. I tried interviewing him. Yeah, I should. I have a problem because of what happened with Errol and Eric that pisses me off. And I would have gotten the memoir right when it came out, but I was so pissed off at him that I just thought I didn't even want to read it.
But if you cannot trust the main narrative from the mainstream media, which obviously you can't do in regards to the Manson murders, but you cannot either trust all kinds of strange theories. Who can you trust? What can you trust? How can you navigate in this landscape?
That's the eternal question. You only can trust your own gut, I think. Maybe what your mother tells you.
She loves me.
Oh, good.
I trust that. Yeah. Okay, Tom. I hope to be able to make a sequel when your next book come out. Or
all right, Stu. Yeah, no problem.
Talk more on off record.
Yeah, and when are you going to put this up?
As soon as we get the file and everything, I send it to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And I'm gonna stop recording now. I'm gonna say a couple of things. Jeg bare trykker på stopp. Det som viktig?
Ja. Stopp.